Okie dokie. Well, welcome everybody. We're a relatively small but very select band tonight. Interesting, lots of names that we don't usually have here, which is probably because of a lack of direct Pictish connection, I suppose, which is interesting. Anyway, I'm absolutely delighted to introduce Steve Birch to give our talk tonight. Steve is a freelance archaeologist working in the Highlands and co-director of the High Pasture Cave project. He graduated in 2005 from Aberdeen University, and his broad research interests include Scottish prehistory, with a particular focus on the use and function of cave and rock shelter sites. So no one better to talk to us about High Pasture Cave. Now, Steve gave this presentation about 3 months ago in person at the wonderful Cromarty Cinema. I missed it. I didn't react quickly enough to get a ticket for the event, so I thought it would be great if we had an opportunity and others had an opportunity to catch up with it here. So here we go. So over to you, Steve. We've got a slight technical problem here with the size of the image for Steve's slides, but I think we can see well enough, and so we'll get going. If you have questions, please, if you could use the chat facility as we go along, and I will pick all of those up at the end, and we'll have a Q&A when Steve's done. So over to you, Steve.
Okay, thank you very much, Alistair. And also thank you, Doug, as well, for trying to sort me out there and getting me back online. And yes, welcome everybody. And thank you to the Gromouse Museum for inviting me along to chat again about High Pasture Cave. And it will be a little bit different tonight than what I did back at Cromarty Cinema. I always like change it around a bit. And also I can refer to some notes a little bit more, because always, whenever I do this chat, this talk on High Pasture Cave, it's such an interesting site. It's so data rich that it's very difficult to cover anywhere near enough of what we did there. But so, getting a few notes down, I'll hopefully cover a little bit more new ground, especially, now we've got the actual the rough out for the publication, and it's gone off to the publishers. So hopefully we'll get some of that back soon. So without further ado, hopefully it'll change. So caves and underground spaces are one of the landscape's most enduring natural features. These mysterious cavities in the ground captivate us. Their entrances draw us in, and where their damp and dark interiors inspire fascination or fear, we recognize caves as otherworldly, transitional and liminal. Caves offer a dark, mysterious entry into where natural and supernatural worlds mingle, so often expressed outwardly in a rich corpus of legend and folklore. Just over 12 years ago, excavations at the High Pasture Cave complex finished, completing the most extensive investigation of a cave in Scotland. The time that has passed between then and our forthcoming publication of the site has witnessed the resurgence of academic interests in the prehistoric and later use of subterranean environments, including caves. These explore previously overlooked theoretical and methodological approaches to cave study on a global scale, and new frameworks examining the agencies of these enduring natural places, a complex interplay between environment, taphonomy, and human activity, drawing too on anthropology and psychology to consider the all-important experiential aspect of cave use. Although elements of High Pasture's apparent use history can be paralleled elsewhere in the Atlantic Iron Age, this place is so far unique within a Scottish context. Our work indicates long-term periodic activity at the site, with clearly some element of generational continuity, seen via specific activities and deposits, which we suggest strongly advocate a ritual focus. As such, the extent and quality of High Pasture's archaeology makes it central to understandings of Iron Age ritual practice in Scotland, and provides a unique opportunity to investigate the role of caves in the cosmology of later prehistoric communities, both in the British Isles and in Europe. A recent resurgence of interest in cave research has seen greater consideration of the place of these enigmatic sites in the worldviews of later prehistoric communities. Traditionally, cave sites have been seen as primarily domestic, temporary homes and shelter for hunter-gatherers, farmers and pastoralists, even though some sites have produced evidence for their use as workshops, for storage, as hideaways, and repositories of human remains. Not all caves are created equal. Underground cavities are endlessly morphologically complex, reflect local environmental characteristics, and vary in the amount of space and light they provide. In archaeology, the definition of caves has historically been so broad that it conveys little useful meaning when understanding function or context. Generally, caves describe spaces that can be entered by humans and that can contain a dark zone, as opposed to rock shelters, which are open, generally more open anyway, and possess light or twilight areas. The distinction between caves and rock shelters and their quality of light is critical to archaeological interpretation. For example, the use of cave dark zones for habitation is rare, while historically it has been suggested that most caves used for refuge were actually rock shelters. As such, the connection of dark zones with ritual, symbolic or liminal space has recently come to the fore in cave research. There is also a growing awareness that we should not investigate caves in isolation. Along with other types of underground structures like souterrains, caves should be seen as part of a much wider cultural and symbolic landscape. And survey, excavation and consideration of the environments and potential contemporaneous activity that site surface should be an essential part of cave study. Beyond this, the wider landscape setting tells more of the story, access and location in relation to contemporary settlement zoning, and whether the cave entrance is hidden from view. Liminality can beget segregation and secrecy, locales for rites of passage, but also where caves located on social boundaries may have been preferred as arenas for aggregation, where people from different communities could come together. There's just a very basic slide there, just showing where High Pasture Cave is. For those who don't know, it's near the little village of Torrin on the road to Elgol from Broadford in Skye. And the photograph there at the bottom, you can see the Lake Martin wild goose standing by the cave entrance before excavations started in 2004, with a sort of dramatic backdrop looking to Blaven and the Black Cuillin. And zooming in a little bit more, the photograph again shows a view over the top of the site. The site is just at the bottom there, at the break of ground, from the rough ground to the green area, the nice fertile ground. So it's in this sort of liminal location between agricultural improved fields and the sort of unimproved, very wet, boggy ground that's as a basement rocks of granite. Obviously, the green areas are limestone, Durness limestone, so they provide this rich agricultural landscape compared to its surroundings. And the basic plan there shows the location of the cave, and the pink sort of passages shown there, over 320 meters of passages. Bone passages highlighted, we'll come to that in a second. The cave's entrance, and there were some shielings and field walls and such like. And the cavers who discovered the site in 1972 from London called it the Cave of the Eye Field, or Uarvanard Hacade, to give it its sort of locational value. Although just one of many cave entrances on the limestone of southern Skye, High Pasture, with its extensive passages and mysterious stream disappearing invitingly underground, was certainly visited during early prehistory, as early finds and a cut-marked boulder confirm. Mesolithic and Neolithic interactions must have been brief and episodic, with no visible trace of use by these earliest visitors in the cave itself. Maybe the dynamism of the location itself, where water stops its cascade to abruptly enter the earth, was enough to mark this as a special place. Alternatively, High Pasture may have served as a good overnight location in the landscape, while foraging or droving livestock between settlements and upland pastures. Interactions with the cave and its surroundings, for all purposes, would have created experiences, stories to embed within local knowledge and folklore. Excavations at High Pasture Cave took place between 2004 and 2010, using volunteers from local communities on Skye and students from the United Kingdom and overseas countries too. A detailed program of post-excavation analysis was carried out between 2006 and ended in 2022. And before going into more detail about our discoveries at High Pasture, it is important to show the major features of what is quite a complex and 3D site. This sort of schematic diagram, if you like, it shows the site when it was almost at its peak, at its flourish, its full flourish, if you like. And what you can see there is a stone enclosure with a staircase leading out of that enclosure down into this passage underground where you can see the figure standing. And that's all to scale. It was all from a laser scan, this. So quite a small passage, about 12, 14 meters long. And the little ramp access at the end accesses down into much wider and larger mainstream passage beyond. And this doesn't show much of the detail. What it does show, and I'll probably come back to this later, is that mound, earth and ash mound, where the person is standing within what we call the precinct. And that's very important because, you know, that is covering a sort of spread of 5 different fireplaces that built up through time, along with all the associated ash and residues. And it seems that what people were doing here was curating rather than clearing away the rubbish from the fires. So they just built one on top of the other. And it obviously has a much more basic beginning. I'll come to that in a second, but it's just getting to your head at the moment. You've got the precinct enclosure, which is the main activity area outside the cave. The staircase, which is, we have a series of staircases are built there, 4 in total, providing access to the underground passage, bone passage. And of course, it was the cave that was the catalyst, if you like, you know, for what went on at this site, for sure. That's what drew people to High Pasture in the first place. And surrounding the actual precinct area at the surface through time, and especially during this phase around about 400 BC, we get quite a big build-up of, it had been normally called a burnt mound or burnt spreads. So lots of firecracked stone, ash, and lots of material. But the major difference, I'll state now, between these different areas is virtually all of the artifacts that were recovered, and that's nearly 2,000 artifacts. It was a very rich site. And most of the ecofacts as well, the animal bone, fish bone, and such like, were discovered in Bone Passage in the cave and also in the precinct enclosure, with very little. I mean, there was a good few artifacts beyond the precinct enclosure, but really it falls away dramatically when you step outside of that core area. And zooming in again on the left-hand side there, you can see the actual cave passages in pink. Most of it's an active linear streamway, like say about 320 meters long. And really, with the exception of Bone Passage, which I'll zoom in on a little more in a second, we found very little else artifact-wise in the main streamway. There was a few things I'll come to, a few special cattle deposits and such like, no artifacts as such. And that's probably because the streamway was quite a dynamic place and still floods in parts to the roof after every rain. And I'll just show on the photograph on the right, you can see me standing there in the entrance of the cave, in the entrance to Bone Passage, where the little A is on the plan. And I'll note at this point, even that cave passage, which was a natural construct, if you like, had been modified. And you can see how the roof of the cave has been chipped away at the top there to remove the limestone. It's been chipped away down the side where I'm holding my trowel to give this sort of doorway appearance. And on the opposite side, where I've got my hand touching the rock, they set some threshold stones and slabs to create another side to what in effect was a doorway to this underground world. And here's a laser scan of Bone Passage. And that's a plan view looking on from the top. And as I say, only about 12, 13 meters, 14 meters long at most. You can see a few photographs there. So one at the top is looking back towards the cave entrance. But at this stage, when that photograph was taken, one of the staircases in place. So you can see some of the treads of the steps. You can see this wonderful white incrustation of calcite, which covers the roof of a lot of the cave. To the right, you can see the Narrows area, a view through the Narrows, myself and Martin Crothers from UHI there, when they had a visit down to the site of specialists. And you can see Martin there squeezing through, and you can see the arrow pointing to that location from the north chamber to enter the ramp that leads down a gradual ramp sort of access into the main streamway. So it made you work to get out of this passage. It wasn't easy to move materials around. And on the bottom right, you can see a view looking up the ramp from the main streamway, a very narrow little fissure leading to that squeeze where you can see Martin at the top there. And I won't go into a great lot of detail on this, but this passage, although it's quite small and quite narrow, didn't really lend itself to human habitation, became this sort of receptacle, if you like, for objects and materials through time. And these different areas, the north chamber, the narrows, the south chamber, and the actual entrance, are all what we call like liminal areas. And it seems like these areas became the focus for the deposition, especially of artifacts, and sometimes the same types of artifacts through deep time, through 600-700 years. And here's a photograph just showing a little bit of the cave, the main streamway, if you like, very varied in its morphology. Lots of nice formations in parts. Other areas are clean washed, marbled limestone. This cave passage has been interrupted quite a lot by volcanic dikes and volcanic activity, which has turned the limestone into marble. And that's why I have some quarries nearby. Well, yeah, beautiful cave and well worth a visit for sure. Repeated visits through the early Bronze Age suggest that the cave was already established as a location, with visible activity including a discrete area of ploughing to the northeast of the main entrance and the erection of a small squat standing stone. This may have marked the location of the cave and perhaps add some ritual significance to the site. Surrounding posts and stake holes accompanied by ceramics and flint may indicate a first structure, at the same time as the first artifacts were placed in the darkest recess of Bone Passage. A cast of ceramic sherds, beaker and plain early Bronze Age wares, lithics and 2 bone tools. And you can just see George there in that sort of dark cavity excavating those ceramic sherds away. And the access to the ramp is just over his shoulder to the right-hand side in that image, getting down to the main streamway. So this early material been put in the darkest part of the cave. We don't know whether more material from this period may have been lost from either the cave or surrounding natural amphitheatre. The cave of the early Bronze Age was a wild, unmodified feature, prone to flooding during heavy rain, access limited to people willing to negotiate its darker recesses. So I'll run now fairly quickly, really. I don't want to dwell too much on the actual excavation bit of it, through a few slides which show the main developments of the complex through time, transforming it from a natural feature into a multi-phase complex over a period of about 800 years through the Iron Age. This is when the site really becomes visible, both in the types of material that's been put there and also in the monumentalizing of the site, if you like, through time. And here you can see the earliest phase of Iron Age activity. It includes the construction of the first formal access to the cave, including a partially paved walkway with retaining walls to either side and steps down into Bone Passage beyond. This phase also included the construction of 2 fireplaces within the precinct, adjacent to the walkway access, and several stake holes that probably formed a screen or partition. Material generated from use of these fireplaces, featuring fuel residues and firecracked stone, was deposited in Bone Passage, along with a range of artifacts and other materials. And a trampled floor surface provided access through Bone Passage to the streamway beyond. And, it's interesting that outside in this sort of natural amphitheatre as it was before it became enclosed by this big precinct wall, there was very few artifacts placed there or animal bone or other types of material at this stage. Of course, they could have been taking material and throwing it into the streamway beyond as well. But if they did, it's not left as any material to recover, probably because it would have been washed through the system. I mean, I've even seen big boulders rumbled through that bit of cave passage. Now, continuing through the early Iron Age, activities at High Pasture included modification to the access arrangements again, including into the cave with 2 consecutive stairwell structures, and you can see one of them here in plan, 2 consecutive walkways and a paved walkway running through Bone Passage itself. So all the time they were modifying and making these changes to the site. In the precinct, 5 slab-built fireplaces were constructed, one on top of the other, with a 5th fire pit located to the south. Other precinct features included the first evidence of wall foundations associated with enclosure of the precinct passage. Of the precinct enclosure, should I say. But also, these walls, we think, were put in place to try and divert water away, because obviously the water normally sinks in a sort of active sink a few meters away from this bone passage entrance. But before any modifications to the site and during very heavy rainwater runoff, this sink would have overflowed, and we've seen that happen when we were working there. But with having no structures in place, it would have run straight down into the original bone passage and in bone passage itself. And again, that may have been why we've lost some material from the very earliest visitations to the site. By the end of this extensive period of use, the buildup of superimposed R's and the associated residues formed a distinct curated mound of material in the precinct's southwest corner. A series of post holes, pits, and low wall foundations located outside the precinct boundary appear to relate to the division of space at the surface, and also this sort of probably a processional way that approached the site. And you can see some of the excavated post holes in red there, leading from the sort of northeast and curving around into the actual precinct enclosure. There's a few artist reconstructions here by Alan Braby. I'm very pleased. He did some really great jobs. Tried to cut out as many of his little birds he normally puts in there. But the main thing with this actual slide is the big sort of dome of ash with all its superimposed R's. And that's how it would have looked for sure. Even when we excavated it, we found, although it had been buried over by later deposits, this very steep-sided slope of material. So they obviously curated that in place, and they were embedding things like caches of cobbled tools, stone tools, bone pins, all types of artifacts were going in there. And we know from thin section micromorphology of the soils in the precinct that primary buttery was taking place there too. You know, we're picking up in the thin section, evidence for viscera and also high levels of phosphate that was coming from this buttery processing. So yeah, it would have been a very smelly, active place whenever people were there for sure. And here's a slide just showing bone passage. And you can see on the left-hand side, the sort of paved walkway. It just led people through the eyes part of the passage and through the narrows to the ramp that leads down to the main streamway. So that was kept in place for around about 300 years with no material placed on top of it. But when they actually formed the walkway in there, they placed a few nice objects, sometimes in between the paving slabs and sometimes just to the side of the passage, which I'll come to in a second. Some of them you can see there in that top photograph. There were 6 or 7 small antler pegs, one of 2 groups, and you can see the locations of them in that right-hand diagram towards the cave entrance, so right in the south chamber, if you like. And these objects were deposited at the time of the construction of the walkway. So maybe there were sort of votive offerings or foundation deposits, as we call them, placed in these little locations. And you can see the concentration of finds in that narrows. And that narrows between the north and south chamber certainly became a focus for activity for 600 or 700 years. And, that's where we put our very first little trial trench, 1 meter wide, which went down to the bedrock floor through about 1 meter of build-up deposits inside. And the sheer numbers of objects we had out of that small area was quite staggering. And there's a close view of some of these little antler pegs. At first, we thought, could there be sort of tuning pegs from a musical instrument or something like this, but it doesn't seem so. And when they've been examined at the National Museum, they've certainly got the circumferential wear it looks like they've been used as some form of weaving equipment. Now you can see at the bottom there a nice weaving comb. We had no complete combs like this, but looking at the 6 pegs that we had in the 2 caches, it could have been a weaving comb that had been broken up, or it was some sort of composite weaving type of apparatus. Some of the other caches that were put in at this early foundation phase in Bone Passage there were a group of these steatite spindle wheels made from soapstone. We're not sure if the soapstone's from Glenelg or further afield, but they're quite interesting. In that cache, you see such a range of the types of objects at the different stages of life. So you've got one that's been broken in half. You've got a couple that have been shaped, but they've not had the central perforation drilled through them. And then you've got some that are complete and brand new and never been used, a couple that have been burnt, and a couple with decoration on them. So it's almost like showing the life of a certain type of object. And as it says there, weaving seems to be of some importance during the early Iron Age. We had 30-odd 40 spindle wheels at this time from the site, and some of them placed around the yards outside, and then lots of different types of pins and points, which could also have been used in textile work. And certainly that's something that we see reflected through caves throughout the UK, even into Ireland as well. And you could say, to some extent, into Western Europe, but certainly in Britain as a whole and the United Kingdom, we do see weaving equipment figuring right through this Iron Age period and into the start of what we call the Roman Iron Age in England and Wales as well. The other group of objects, which was quite remarkable, they were placed in the narrows, and they were placed on top of each other in a little pile, and they become encrusted and corroded together because they were made of iron. And quite a remarkable set of objects, very rare, probably complete when they were put in there. So at the top left, you've got an iron hadz, and you can see part of its wooden handle made of alder, still in situ, so it was probably a complete object when it was placed there. You can see the X-ray at top right. Down at the bottom left, you've got a socketed iron axe. Shape-wise, it's very similar to the ones you get in the late Bronze Age, but here we can see one of the very earliest types of these axes made of iron, a significant change in technology. And along with them were these little horrible orange corroded lumps. And of course, it's only when you get them X-rayed, when the National Museum did their magic, that you could see there was these really fine links of chain linked together, and one or two just lying there by themselves. And these links of chain the wire was 1 millimeter in diameter. So incredible craftsmanship for what was some of the earliest metalwork in Scotland. So from the start of the early Iron Age and through the subsequent Middle Iron Age up to about 150 BC, modifications and elaboration of the site infrastructure included the construction of new stairwells accessing Bone Passage, areas of paving, and the gradual enclosure of the precinct, resulting in the construction of a massive enclosure wall defining the precinct area and incorporating the stairwell access to the cave. Residues generated in the combined hearths produced evidence for intense use, including a number of individual burning episodes, while significant amounts of material deposited within the precinct at this time contained large quantities of artifacts and ecofacts, including caches of material and evidence for structured deposition. And you can see there the two fireplaces in yellow. So you can see where people would have accessed the precinct through this entrance at the southwest, coming in on the paved area, and they would have had to pass between these two fires, which are only sort of a couple of meters apart, 2.5 meters apart, to get to this access into the stairwell. So whether that was used as some sort of, was it for cleansing? Was it some sort of dramatic effect? So especially when somebody emerging out of the stairwell would have appeared between these banks of flame and smoke, it would have been quite dramatic, especially if that took place at night or in the hours of darkness. And on the right, you can see a couple of photographs there showing the final stage of the stairwell, and the bit where you can see Martin standing there would have had a stone corbelled roof over the top. So quite a structure. And of course, the building of these stairwells through time would have made Bone Passage an even darker place than it was when it had an open sort of access entrance, if you like. We also found evidence for a wooden door at one phase, and also evidence for a I won't say textile, it was a screen made of bast, so maybe nettle fibres or something like this, which was still held together in some instances, and they were draped down the steps, and it looks like it had been burnt at some stage, whether by accident or on purpose, we can't tell. So they were enclosing the space as well. The intensification in structural development across the site through the Iron Age, including the larger scale deposition events, suggests larger aggregations of people. At some time between 350 and 50 BC, a sequence of events took place at High Pasture leading up to the site's final closure. This included the placement of special cattle deposits in 4 separate locations in the cave, 2 in Bone Passage and 2 along the main stream passage. And here's a little plan. You can see Bone Passage there with the structures above at the surface. Those little red blobs are where these very special cattle deposits were placed. So 2 in Bone Passage, 1 on a ledge high above the ice streamway. You can see Tim Lawson there, caver, geomorphologist, actually climbing up this old waterfall feature to where this cattle deposit had been placed on the ledge high above the stream. And then the other one was in this sort of what we call lake passage, a little ponded passage, a dry passage with a pond at the end, and the bones for that cow deposit were placed beyond that. And just to give you some idea, you know, these animals, one of them was almost complete, 12, 18 months old. That one was placed in a little boulder setting in Bone Passage. It was so complete, although heavily butchered at the surface, they must have carried all these bones in, collected them, carried them into the cave for deposition in this setting. And when I recovered them with the other team members, we were able to reconstruct even long bones that have been broken open to extract marrow. So intensively process these animals, whereas the other 3 deposits really just comprise joints of material, the very meat-rich joints. So it may have been used in a feast, and then the bones from those animals were placed at these special locations within the cave. And the other major sequence that went in was a big dump of midden was placed in the south chamber of Bone Passage. This contained a large quantity of artefacts, but then on top of that was placed this very large and very complete assemblage of pig bone. And you can see there it added up to about 23 individual animals, represented by mainly young animals, around about 8 months at death. They've been butchered in quite specific ways. You can see the skulls have been cleaved in half. Even the backbones, the vertebrae, have been cleaved off, almost they're dividing the carcass in 2. But this hadn't been done with a saw. This was done with knives. You know, there was no saws available at this time. So some care had gone to the way these animals have been divided up. But unlike the cattle that were put in these special deposits elsewhere, the pig long bones were complete. They hadn't broken them open to get marrow. So either, you know, the pigs were being dealt with in a different way after death, because all these bones, again, after butchery at the surface and feasting, potentially were collected and carried into the cave for this secondary deposition. But Peter Connery from Durham University, who's looked at this material along with Carrie Drew, as she was then, they think full well, by comparing with other assemblages, that this was a big feasting deposit. And because there was a surplus of meat, there was no requirement to split open the long bones to get the marrow. So quite significant. You can see they're killed between November and January, working on a farrowing date for pigs today. So it may have gone with a winter solstice or leading up to a winter solstice, when a special feast and maybe celebrations of types and deposition of artifacts was taking place. And there again, you can see some of the reconstructed pig bones showing how complete they are compared to the cattle. But you can see the cut marks where, you know, they divided these animals up quite well, maybe for cooking and eating and everything else. But again, the bone didn't show any evidence of burning. So it looks like they were filleting the meat off for cooking off the bone, if you like. But then the bones were dealt with in this very specific way. And there's just a little reconstruction, again, just showing what the activity in the precinct may have been like. And you see one of the pigs strapped up there, ready for cutting down the sagittal line and cleaving through the skull. A structured artifact deposit was also placed at the base of the stairwell steps before this structure was closed using boulders and midden, including stonework from the head of the stairwell, including its corbelled stone roof. So they've almost collapsed the thing in, if you like, and then filled the cavity with midden from the surface, firecracked stone, and one or two objects. At the surface, midden deposits were spread across the surface of the precinct, including a wide range of artefacts, while access to the head of the stairwell was also blocked with boulders and midden deposits. It is possible that some small-scale activities took place at the surface after the stairwell and access to the cave had been closed. But, this wasn't that evident when we were carrying out the excavations. So here you can see some of the rotary querns from the site. All the rotary querns have been broken, fragmented, and you can see some of them have even been whacked with metal objects when they were breaking them up, and placed around different areas of the site. Some in caches together. A group of 3 of these fragments were placed by the entrance to this block staircase. And then finally, and this is the interesting bit, the site remained as it was with the backfill staircase, but obviously there was memory, there was history wrapped up with this site. And somewhere between 150 and 260 years after the stairwell had been backfilled, the final closure of the complex took place. And this included the deposition of a combination of human and animal remains as closing deposits into the top of the backfilled stairwell. And you can see in the sort of cross section there, you can see the bones of the adult woman. You can see on the photograph laid out over the top of the original backfill deposits, and then she was again backfilled over the top with boulders in her own right. But you'll see there's that little sort of pocket of sort of buff colour with a little, I don't know, hopefully it's big enough for you to read, but those were the cranial and backbone remains, if you like, of an unborn fetus and a just born perinate human, and they were mixed there with the fetal pig and a perinatal dog. So they've almost been matched like for like. And the long bones of the neonate and perinate human were placed between the woman's legs. So this very unusual way of splitting the bones apart. There was no evidence for cut marks on the bone. So we have to think that these individuals were probably been excarnated potentially, so that they could naturally decompose to a certain state, and then they could lay the bones out as we see them now. Although the woman must have been semi-articulated to be placed in that location, unless she was excarnated in the top of the backfill staircase with some sort of structure over the top to protect her from scavengers, because there was certainly no evidence, except for a bit of gnawing by rodents through time, of dog gnawing or larger carnivores getting at the bones. So a very unusual deposit, and that was the final closure of the site, if you like. And within the areas surrounding the precinct, structured deposits including metalworking residues, lots of iron slag, and earth bases and things like this. There was a glass bead, a type we normally see. You see it in the centre there, found in northeast Scotland. A Roman coin, along with a very eroded Roman coin, I'll add, but it has been confirmed as such, along with a number of rotary quern fragments. And you can see there's also this wonderful double-linked chain, and this fantastic, a very large, ostentatious spearhead, which had been at its tip bent over before deposition. But again, like most of the iron tools we found at the site, which were complete, this also had elements of its wooden aft still in place. And you can see the little sort of bronze rivet or copper rivet that's holding that in place. I think it was bronze, holding it in place. So a remarkable little set of objects placed around the head of the stairwell and in the immediate area that was then backfilled over with boulders and other types of material. So in effect, after all this material went in, they actually landscaped over the site, and that was it, really put out of use for good. Is that really the time? So I'm just going to skip through a few photos now. Just showing some of the human remains. I'd mentioned there about the complete individuals who went into the site, the woman and the perinate and the fetus. But we also had quite a few fragmentary human remains relating to quite a few adults. It could be 12 or 14 individuals represented that was spread normally through midden deposits at the site. So we can't be sure if, again, if there are a lot of peripheral things like teeth and toe bones and things like this. So again, were they related to people who've been excarnated in the cave and they took the rest of the remains away for deposition elsewhere? Or are these individual bits of human offerings in their own right, like the fragments of pottery, like the other objects I'm going to talk about in a second? So just one last thing I'll say about the humans. I'm only showing this one chart. Obviously, we did a lot of science on the humans, and we know now through DNA analysis, ancient DNA, that the woman was the mother of the unborn fetus, whereas she wasn't the mother of the perinate that accompanied them, that was born just at death. But interestingly, another thing we looked at was diet. And, the woman showed quite a different signature to some of the individuals at the site. She may have moved away from High Pasture Cave, or she was away from High Pasture Cave, then moved to High Pasture Cave. But the individuals who really stand out here are on the far right-hand side. So the woman, the adult woman, and obviously her offspring, which had a register from herself, she had a normal diet in a way. It was quite high in protein, so it could have been high in pig, or it could have been freshwater fish, although we have no bones from freshwater fish at the site, or things like this. But the individual K, two individuals potentially, an adolescent and a young child, both almost had an exclusively marine diet. So it just asks this question, where did these individuals derive from? Have we got people moving into the site from elsewhere who had this marine diet? Or have you just got individuals who don't like meat and they're just eating fish? We can make a lot of it, of course, but, it's interesting to sort of think about. One of the things we'd really like to know about the site is how far people were traveling. Did it attract people from far afield? So I'm now just going to run through the artifact assemblage. I'll just show this. It's over 1,900 artifacts. That includes some sherds of pottery, but also lots of coarse stone tools, quern stones, saddle querns, rotary querns, cobble tools and such like, objects in bone, antler and tooth, including a sperm whale tooth object, iron objects, complete and fragmentary, copper alloy, glass, shale. You'll see there. So you get quite a mix. You've almost seen all the types of materials you'd see at any big settlement site in Scotland, like a Brock or a Ilford or something like this. But here we found them in this little exclusive hole in the ground and the precinct, the small precinct that surrounds it, which is about the size of a prehistoric roundhouse. And obviously it's very important the way we should look at these artifacts, because one thing we have to ask is, because we've got no evidence for habitation at this site, in the cave or structures at the surface, where was this material coming from? What's it telling us about the society who brought these objects to the site? And were the objects used at the site, or were they bought exclusively for deposition as votive or ritual type offerings? And that's quite an interesting thought to ponder. So the most numerous objects, as I mentioned, are stone. Obviously, they survive the best. And here you can see some of the big saddle querns, some of them really huge objects, heavy to carry. You need two people to carry the big one at the bottom there. You can see George Kozikowski, Lake George there, with a large granite saddle quern that was recovered from the bottom of the staircase in Bone Passage. And what's interesting, all the complete querns, the saddle querns, were all deposited with the working face down. So almost, when we see this elsewhere, as if they've been put out of use. Others have been fragmented and spread around the site. Some have been built into stairwells and structures and paving. But you can see we could refit them back together again, see the impact scars where they've been broken. So deliberate damage. And we know that is going on generally at this time elsewhere. And a little quern rubber at the bottom there. Cobble tools, obviously hundreds of these, and wide ranging from grinders to pallets, rubbing stones, multifunctional tools. You can see some that have been used as hammers and grinders. And the nice little one at the bottom there, you can see little striation lines where it's been used as like a sharpening stone or a whetstone. The ones with the dark residues at the bottom center and bottom right, that's from working leather. So, we've got leather working tools as well. So showing a real wide range of different types of use. This type of objects, has not been enough study carried out as yet really on Iron Age stone tools. One of the most common objects yet, we're only just now starting to get some idea what they were used for in prehistory. Some were deposited in caches, as you see here, in groups, placed in the ash of the fireplaces or in the passage underground. And you can see they're going from really heavily worn objects to some objects that had hardly seen any use at all. And indeed, with this group of 23 that were put in one pit in the ash mound, there was some 5 pebble blanks amongst them. So they were incorporating objects that had seen no use at all. So again, we're seeing life histories of these different types of objects. Spindle wheels, I mentioned them before, but there you see some of them showing in 3 different planes in photography, made of steatite and one from actinolite. And I'll mention that funny name because that isn't local to Skye. That is a Dalradian geology that's coming probably from somewhere in Argyll. Shale, lots of shale, cannel coal, no complete bangles or things like this, which is what we're looking at here. Most of them are fragmentary. There's one fragment bottom right there of a beautiful soapstone bangle, highly polished, but again broken. Some of these were showing evidence for reuse and repair, with little holes drilled in them to try and keep them serviceable, but at some stage they're deemed fit to be given up to this site. And at the top right, you can see a waster there from the big thick object where they've actually removed on some sort of lathe an actual bangle to polish up into a finished object. So again, we're getting displays of crafts at the various stages. And what's interesting, like say, with that, around half of the individual finds are categorized as tools or craft debris, including evidence for non-ferrous metalworking, such as crucibles and copper alloy offcuts, and antler waste. So we have to ask this question, was craft production a major part of the High Pasture Cave complex identity? Was it taking place either at the site or in the surrounding landscape? Whatever, it was deemed important enough that they'd left large quantities of it in certain locations at the site. Such questions need to consider both site morphology and the abundant evidence for structured deposition. And in the absence of in situ related structural evidence, such as furnaces and such like, we have to ask, was the activity taking place elsewhere and these objects were then carried in for deposition as something special that's related to that craft taking place at the settlements or whatever. So as I mentioned, the complete ironworking process from ore to artifact is seen within the High Pasture Cave assemblage. And examining its context is essential to understand whether every stage of this complex activity took place on site or whether, again, the material was brought in. While on-site blacksmithing seems likely, with hammer scale retrieved from some of the precinct fireplaces, evidence for smelting is less clear. A large furnace lining fragment dating to the early Iron Age is one of the early Scottish examples, indicating that those visiting High Pasture Cave had access to a new and possibly exotic craft. However, no evidence for an in-situ furnace. As I mentioned before, we have to question where this took place. And here you can see an assemblage of some of the vitrified material, vitrified clay, vitrified stone, little molds, crucibles for holding bronze, very heavily used, very heavily burnt and fragmented. So at the end of the use, some of these, some are broken. And at the bottom left in the diagrams there, you can see part of the tuyere, which was a wodge of clay they put on the furnace and they poked the bellows through to blow air into the furnace itself. At the time of High Pasture, when ironworking was relatively new, the significance and impact of this visually dramatic and transformative craft must have been great. The act of ironworking and non-ferrous metalworking, the resulting products and debris, and the workers themselves were perhaps viewed as symbolically charged, and their presence at this site, or at least the materials they handled and produced, is in keeping with this. And here's some of the finished objects in iron. And again, some of these are quite rare. These crook-headed pins, we've got, I think it's 7 of the 10 types of that type of pin from Scotland. Ring-headed pins, again, similar to the earlier Bronze Age types. And we did get Bronze Age types, obviously, continuing through the Iron Age as well, with this ring headers also. The object bottom left in the diagram there we've seen before, the little axe, the little bag axe made of iron. Well, you can see there's another little socketed tool there. We can't be sure what it is on the bottom left. And then at the right in the drawing is a woodworker's gouge, socketed again with part of its wooden aft in place. And the iron tang dagger, you can see there, nice little dagger, got these lovely encrusting residues showing it was deposited complete in its sheath. So these were full objects, very valuable objects you wouldn't normally just throw away. So the content and depositional context of the antler-working assemblage also questions its material source. This included at least 75 fragments of working debris, both shed and gathered antler, perhaps prepared beam segments, for example, and strips, and tying offcuts, suggesting that much of the material was yet to be used. A large concentration of this debris was recovered from a small and focused area in the north chamber of Bone Passage, suggesting a token or votive deposit or cache. In addition, there are a few primary offcuts, suggesting that some antlers may have been part processed elsewhere. This may indicate that antler material arrived at the site intended for deposition rather than these activities taking place as a craft activity on site. But of course, the assemblage of antler and bone objects display examples from raw materials right through to a wide range of finished objects. And here you can see a small selection of some of the points, hauls, and pins from the site, little spatula type pins as well. So a wide range of different types of objects made in these materials. Some of the finer pins you can see in top right there, beautiful needle, almost looks like an iron needle from today. Evidence for some pins, they were trying to repair them and re-drill them, but it never worked out. Some of these were put in the site in groups, others were broken, and we can't be sure if they were broken deliberately or whether, you know, they were trampled through post-depositional taphonomy and things like this. Top left there is the sperm whale tooth object, probably a little pommel from a knife or dagger, highly polished, highly finished, but it doesn't look like it was ever fitted to the knife or dagger. This is an object, high status material, and it's just been put in as an offering in its own right. Fragments of combs, unfortunately, we only have parts of the combs surviving, so wee fragments of them. And then these little antler armatures or handles with these little antler pins going through them. We thought they're knife handles, composite knife handles or such like, or were they something again from a musical instrument? But the little pegs suggested to the National Museum, Fraser Hunter and Gemma, who looked at this material, that they were probably attached to wooden objects with some sort of embellishment, organic embellishment on another type of organic object. And again, you can see an antler tine that's made into some sort of peg, maybe a thong stretcher or something like this. And these little hook type objects, which again could have been used for picking up weave or for yarn in some sort of textile type function. And of crucial importance for the assemblage is understanding the degree to which artefacts and materials were locally derived or were transported to High Pasture from further afield. This informs not only the potential and relative significance of the assemblages, but also where visitors lived, how far they travelled, and thus how important High Pasture was in Iron Age Skye and beyond. While the artefact assembly is almost all made from locally available materials and displays manufacturing traditions current in Iron Age Skye, there are a few interesting exceptions. The Roman coin and the Latin sheetwork are both visibly exotic, as is a double-link chain incorporating recycled Roman material. However, most copper alloy finds fit local traditions, and along with objects such as glass beads, are known from elsewhere on Skye, indicating that these were in common circulation. The stone assemblage is predominantly local, from Skye or the immediate mainland, but provides a few intriguing non-local items. The steatite, talc schist, used to manufacture many of the spindle wheels in the bangle, is plausibly from Glen Elg Peninsula on the adjacent mainland, but equally may have derived from sources further afield, including Shetland. Sources of oil shale from which some of the bangle fragments are manufactured have also been tentatively identified in North Skye and South Rarsay, where Jurassic oil shales have been reported, although these have not been assessed for workability. Visual characteristics suggest 3 different sources were used for the bangles from High Pasture, and other potential sources are markedly further afield, with oil shales occurring widely in the central belt of Scotland, Brora and Sutherland, and south of the border. The stone items are interesting, and we have a few items there manufactured in what we call Dalradian geology, most likely sourced in Argyll. These include a pair of rotoquern fragments and a decorated palette of garnet mica schist and that actinolite schist spindle wheel, and along with 2 greenstone rubbers. And were these just trade routes and open? But some things you could say, like the querns, maybe were viable for transportation, although normally querns are manufactured from local stone. But the eyed rubbers and the spindle wheel, would you really transport the raw materials that far, or the finished object? Or are we seeing people traveling from those different locations to visit High Pasture Cave? Was it some sort of shrine that drew people from so far afield? Obviously, further scientific prominence will be required to sort that out. Excuse me, Doug, can I just come in? How long have we got, please?
Yeah, as long as you want.
Are we okay? We haven't got an hour time limit. I know we're a little bit late getting off the ball.
No.
If everybody's okay, I'll go on, because I've got a little bit to go and some important stuff as well.
Nobody's left yet.
Okay, thank you. So just before I take that slide down, you can see there we've got 2 fragments from tweezers, bronze tweezers. So, grooming artifacts, if you like. And again, we have very few of these from Scotland. I think there's 2 other examples, but you do see them deposited in caves south of the border, especially during the Roman Iron Age. And you also see similar types of artifacts like that placed in the Roman shrines above ground. But interestingly, you can see that nice little bronze spiral ring, again, quite a common type across Iron Age Scotland. But in the top left, you can see this bronze bangle that's been broken up deliberately, placed together in a little cloth pouch, and then placed in the cave. So again, evidence for sort of structured deposition and fragmentation of that object, really putting it out of use. So the deposition of these objects at High Pasture was the last of a long series of actions in which these objects were involved, one or more of which may constitute the reason for their deposition as much as the object itself. As discussed to some extent previously, objects deposited at the site include complete items, but also others that display fragmentation or deliberate damage, as the bangler I was mentioning there. Smashed saddle and rotary querns, some deposited in caches, display violence, evidence of overkill in the form of cut marks and defacing of the grinding faces of rotary querns. The rotary quern fragments seem to have been halved and quartered, rather than fractures resulting from accidental or in situ damage. And as I mentioned before, that large iron spearhead placed at the time of the burials had its tip bent over. And we only know that because it was corroded in place against the actual spearhead itself. And, that echoes the treatment of weapons and oars across Europe in later prehistory, especially during the late Bronze Age, where swords were bent and objects are put out to use before putting them in, say, watery, boggy pools and things like this. And the placing of these fragmented objects into caves is seen elsewhere. For example, at French Cave in Greece, while ethno-historically, among the Maya of South America, year renewal offerings are placed in caves and often consist of old, worn out, or broken objects. Fragmentation has been interpreted as the ritual killing or sacrifice of objects prior to deposition, and also as signalling creation and expenditure of social wealth. The fragmentation premise postulates that objects were first regularly and deliberately fragmented, and the resulting fragments were then often reused in an extended use life. The reintegration of such object parts with different life histories forms a supercharged, structured deposition of all stages of an object's biography: the birth of the complete object, its fragmentation, the reuse of different parts in different contexts, and the reintegration as a part of its final deposition. It is possible that, along with complete objects, the deposition of fragments of the same types of material would have enhanced a deliberate deposition. And the cache of steatite spindle wheels I mentioned before, deposited in Bone Passage, as I mentioned, it contains the complete new objects, but also well-used, broken, and burnt examples as well. And fragmentation also may relate to the human body, as we've seen at High Pastures, with its processing and the funerary rite, perhaps featuring deliberate fragmentation, dispersal, and deposition of the body parts, maybe back into the settlements themselves. And we certainly find bits of people in the Iron Age in drains under rock floors and in other types of structures like wheelhouses. So it could be that excarnation and disarticulation is taking place in places like caves, such as seen at MacArthur's Cave in Oban, for example, where there's 4 Iron Age individuals left by the looks of it for excarnation. And then, those circulator remains are brought back amongst the living as expressions of relationships with the dead before final deposition. However, the recovery of many intact items is also significant, usually seen within bigger groups or placed in structural elements at the site. Objects such as a fine bone pin, a decorated spindle wheel, or an iron spearhead were still usable and unlikely to be casually discarded or lost. The iron assemblage is a particularly good example, suggesting specific depositional habit. Half of the 42 objects were deposited intact and included large tools such as the socketed axe, the adze, and weapons. Several had evidence for mineralized wooden afts, indicating that they formed complete objects at the time of deposition. Other mineralized organic traces indicate that one of the daggers, as I said, was in a leather scabbard, and a ring-headed pin had been broken into 3 parts, placed in a leather back pouch, and then again placed into the cave. This is rare evidence, of this type of structured deposition, especially in a cave site. The marked contrast in the deposition of intact versus fragmented objects at High Pasture may thus intimately relate to votive, a complete object, or sacrificial, should I say, fragmented object. And I'll just mention before I move on, one of the finds that really caught a lot of people's imagination at the time was this fragment from a musical instrument. So a musical instrument bridge manufactured from oak, showing an incredible amount of technological detail, had been charred in a fire. And it was accompanied by other laths of alder, finely worked, other types of wooden objects, wooden bowls, that's been burnt in a low energy fire, not to full carbonization. Otherwise, this thing wouldn't have survived as it has. And also in that same fire, along with these charred wooden objects, were the charred fragments from a human skull, from an adult human male, by the looks of it. And here you can see Graham from University of Cambridge, Graham Lawson, who did the musicology along with John Purser from Salmorostig on Skye. And Graham put together a few reconstructions to see how this thing may have operated. And, tried a parchment backing, and tried the wooden boards, which we did appear to find some on site. And it seemed to form some sort of strumming object, but 7 strings, beautifully manufactured, and a lot of technology has gone into that. And obviously in the publication, there's quite a chapter given over to this very important find. All right, where am I gone? Lose my place. High Pasture Cave is by any estimate an highly unusual site. And this is particularly true for its environmental assemblages, as well as what we've already talked about, the artifact assemblages. While we can indeed consider the data sets within the more familiar arenas of subsistence, of resource use, of local environmental conditions, ultimately, this is neither what they represent, nor in possibly more instances than we can establish from where they derive. The environmental material from High Pasture is a rare example of a data set that, in the absence of local evidence for domestic habitation, appears to represent not only an apparent primarily ritually deposited sequence, but also one unparalleled in Iron Age Scotland in bulk and diversity, especially in such a small focus location as High Pastures. The undoubtedly special nature of the High Pasture site makes it difficult to use the environmental assemblages as any sort of proxy for wider considerations of patterns of subsistence, husbandry, cultivation, and general resource use in Iron Age Skye. The likelihood is that the organic remains deposited at the site represent a specifically chosen, often perhaps curated subset of the resources available locally. One particular question is the extent to which the High Pasture environmental assemblages, in the light of their heavily curated character, can address the question of local domestic activity. We have no clear answers, of course, but we may look to elements of the exotic within the artifact assemblages to conclude that it is likely that visitors to High Pasture may have come significant distances, and that elements of preparation and organisation on a larger scale may have involved individuals from a wide catchment area. And, is it possible that even a lot of these organic materials end up at the site coming in from much further afield? Right. I'll just mention before we move on, middens. We have a lot of middens at High Pasture Cave, and a lot of this material is deposited in a midden type concept. So animal bone, ash, charcoal, all the different things that make up a kitchen type midden. And as I mentioned before, it's clear that these materials, they weren't swept away at High Pasture Cave. They were curated through time, including that big mound of ash with all the objects and ecofacts and artifacts it contained. They didn't clean a hearth, they left the residues on top, they maybe used it again, and then they built another hearth on the top and started all over. So they're retaining this history, if you like, of what went before. And we know middens are very important materials. We see them used in domestic structures as well, built into the, places like Skye Brae, used as the infill of the walls and things like this. And yes, these materials in that sort of constructural element may have been important for keeping out the cold and the wind as some sort of insulation. But also, are we looking at symbolic use of midden, as often been recited, where you've got that affluent use and generation of a byproduct that is then used in another way or displayed in another way at a site. So, archaeologists have not always been successful in defining ritual assemblages. A challenging aspect at High Pasture was the large assemblage deposited, especially within Bone Passage. This low, restricted, damp space housed the evidence of a disproportionately wide range of crafts and economic activities, as you can see here. And we also, on top of that, have the evidence for the other activities that take place normally on a settlement or elsewhere. But here, they're focused in this one small place: the hunting and gathering of wild resources, livestock husbandry, and all these types of things were the burnt grain we had from the site, huge caches of burnt grain, clean grain. It's been burnt and then deposited. So they're not eating this material, and it's too big a quantities to be just an accidental burning event on the fires. And it's where they put these materials after, in the fills of the stairwell walls, on paved areas at the top of the stairwells, or in the cave, that makes them much more interesting. Caches of periwinkle shells put underneath paving slabs as a little votive offering in its own right. So yeah, we're seeing these sort of things going on at the site. Just making sense of them, of course, is much more difficult. So, generally, the artifact and environmental assemblages from High Pasture broadly fit with what would normally be found in a domestic Iron Age context in Scotland. And I say, especially something like a broch or a dune or a wheelhouse or something like this. But as I mentioned before, it's like all of the craft and economic activities that one cultural group could practice, along with funerary rites, were represented in this narrow cave and its precinct just outside. Activities that could or would take place elsewhere within the settlement zone. And in many respects, you could say that these represent a symbolic mirror of real or maximized activities sublimated in a ritual context. The artifact and environmental assemblies from High Pasture broadly fit in what we would normally call domestic. But as I say, in this context and in this, the morphology of the cave and everything else, we really have to call that into question. It's one interesting fact that makes this site so interesting to look at. And, what we've undertaken so far is really the start. There'll be a lot of work for other people to move on to. And the cave morphology, as I mentioned, really that narrow, damp passage, it does not lend itself to occupation. And indeed, we had no in situ fireplace within the cave. So it looks like the cave itself was just used for these depositional events. There is strong association between cave use and the perception of water as cosmologically significant in prehistory, the ultimate life giver and yet capable of destruction. Ritual constructs surrounding water seem often to be attempts to define its unpredictability, the source of life, but also death imbued with animistic qualities. A long tradition of depositing objects and materials into rivers and pools appears to extend very much to specifically underground watery contexts. It is possible that the idea of underground and underwater was strongly connected in prehistory, their cosmological distinction even blurred. Depositing material into caves and rivers may thus have served a similar purpose, representing the same symbolic act. Links between mortuary practice, metalworking, water and caves all into broader linked cosmology. Special power then might reside in a complex cave featuring an active watercourse, such as High Pasture Cave. And we see these locations serve as a focus for the deposition of human remains, as well as extensive artifact assemblages during the Iron Age and Roman Iron Age, especially in the other parts of the British Isles. Most research into European cave use has focused on particular time periods, individual site assemblages or specific regions, but more recent studies have explored the crucial basic elements, cave morphology, location, and the wider social, environmental, and landscape context of cave use. Our attempts to contextualize High Pasture within a current archaeological framework indicates that similar cave types seem to have been used in similar ways, particularly karst caves, that's limestone caves, displaying complex morphology, multiple chambers, and especially an underground stream. And see there, these little charts put together by Sam Wilford for his PhD, and it just shows a scatter of sites that have produced human remains both in articulated and disarticulated form. And here's that same chart, and I've embedded on top of this the same group of caves showing those in multiple chambers and underground streams that have produced significant numbers of Iron Age and Roman Age artifacts highlighted in red. And you see High Pasture Cave there, but also we've got these other caves which really stand out. I mean, one of the things, unfortunately, we're dogged with any research like this is a lot of these caves were excavated 100, 150 years ago even, some of them a bit more recently. So, we don't always have the detailed data to say, for example, at Cuillin in Mendeep, to separate away what was Iron Age material and what was followed as Roman Iron Age material going into that cave. But anyway, the rich assemblages and human remains seen at High Pasture Cave are echoed at sites such as Cuillin in Mendeep, Victoria Cave in Yorkshire, and Ogof Iresgreen in South Wales. And we can interpret their selection as special places based on a range of shared characteristics. Similar choices seem to have been made at coastal caves also, such as Sculptor's Cave in Moray, Bourne Cave, Fiskeveg Rock Shelter, Culverhole and Minchinole, where difficulty of access and liminal location between land and sea seems to have attracted similar practices. And here, these slides here, just of these are mainly single chamber former sea caves or rock shelters. Fiskeveg, myself and Martin excavated there, huge assemblage of artifacts the same, some bits of human remains, big feasting assemblage on cattle. But you look at its location, it is so difficult to get to, even by sea, with its rocky foreshore and offshore reefs. The coastal caves, including Sculptor's Cave, that Ian Armit and Lindsay Butzer have been ending up the excavations there. Again, difficult of access. Same with Minchinole and Bourne Cave in Kirkcudbright. So really interesting sites, but unfortunately many excavated by early antiquarians. So we don't have a great history from those sites as to what really went on there. Such selections and patterns of activity may illustrate shared cosmological beliefs extending across Britain, and to judge from sites such as Trou de Harn, Biscacala Cave, or Bull Rock Cave as it's called, and Dureza Cave, which I don't have a picture of, it's a vertical fissure cave, also into continental Europe. Again, these sites display incredible assemblages of material, often placed in the streams where they run underground, or in these big underground pools, as you see at top right here, in the Trou de Harn Cave in Belgium, where divers recovered amazing objects. I think it was like 2 tons of ceramics came out of that site. It was phenomenal over a long period of time. Now, just getting towards the end now, so bear with me for this last little bit. It is impossible to comprehend the detail of the events and activities that took place at High Pasture. We can, however, imagine that the management of light, acoustics, colour, and the materials on display would have created a physically immersive experience. Accessing different areas of the site, and especially the restricted space of Bone Passage, would have been a profound experience in both a public, communal, and also a private sense, incorporating a sense of the past, of links with the ancestors. As well as undoubtedly being a place of performance and theatre, of large gatherings of people, High Pasture may also have been a place of veneration, of quiet contemplation, of both collective and personal ceremonies and rituals on a smaller or more exclusive scale. We can imagine many of the deposited objects relating to daily life and craft activities, heirlooms, tokens, even fragments of people themselves, representing individual personal acts. At both ends of the scale, those who came to High Pasture would become part of a constant reaffirmation and conservation of what was a sacred place and space. High Pasture would have provided an environment with a number of qualities able to supercharge the ritual experience, its complex morphology, its underground stream, an isolated location. The old would have offered a unique experience within a location which may have been transitional in other ways, perhaps on the edge of specific land parcels, and thus linked with boundaries, rights, and ancestral connections. This likely influenced development of the site through time, as what was a completely natural construct was transformed into a human-modified space, largely designed in order to control access to the underground, and perhaps the deliberate limiting of available space therein. Similar developments are identified in Bronze Age Crete, where Tompkins suggests that caves were appropriated by emerging elites as useful power spaces, important to the construction of identity and territory. The intensification of material deposition through time at High Pasture might reflect territorial expansion, tension, or more active negotiation of relationships within and perhaps between communities. Perhaps control of the flow of material into the complex reflected the strength of a community's claim on their local landscape. Within and perhaps between, just lost me with that. Perhaps control of the flow material into this complex reflects the strength of a community's claim on their local landscape, the creation of a legitimate history via material composition and deposition. The generation and accumulation of these cultural signifiers and their curation and manipulation may have bolstered the position of those who undertook these processes. The High Pasture Cave deposits as a bank of cultural capital that could be stored, curated, reworked, and recycled through time, possibly reinforcing community identities and creating shared memories. The very processes of curation of materials and deposits at High Pasture, including the incorporation of old into the new, may therefore relate directly to the transference of status. This may also have been referenced in the built architecture. Although structural modifications to the complex were concerned with maintaining access to the cave and the underground realm, the physical evidence of earlier structures which were retained in situ and curated through time, the superimposed earth settings and associated ash deposits, and especially the enclosure walls and stairwells, these things would have been remembered and they would have been seen by people revisiting, knowing that these earlier structures were incorporated into the fabric of the site. By occupying the same space and incorporating elements of earlier structures, any new construction was perhaps physically and metaphorically bonded to those who came before, extending the biography of that line, enhancing kingship links, rights, and inheritance. Artifacts and materials may also have formed an important source of information, connecting people with places through time. Acts of deliberate breakage, fragmentation, and the distribution of material parts can be seen as a reflection of construction of such relationships between people and objects, even a form of inheritance. Fragmentation of an object may have significant endings or beginnings, breakage both symbolizing and empowering this transition from one state to another. It has also been suggested that actions associated with fragmentation could symbolize the decommissioning of objects thought to contain a particular potency or social significance which had become polluted in some way and thus could no longer be used in daily life. Such items may have had to be carefully disposed of with appropriate rituals, including their fragmentation, to render them safe. Items belonging to the deceased or objects used within funerary rituals may have fallen into this category. Artifacts for use in the afterlife may also have been broken. Breaking an object effectively removed it from the earthly realm. A fundamental difference between the concepts of offering and sacrifice may also be expressed via breakage. Hubert and Maus emphasize that sacrifice should include, if not destruction of, then at least considerable physical transformation, changes making the object or being acceptable to the supernatural world. By contrast, the physical state of an offering is not altered. And that's maybe we have many of these beautiful complete objects at the site too. The religious or supernatural energy of the sacrifice is higher, its ceremonial destruction requiring particular effort and recognition. High Pasture was then replete with highly ritually charged materials and objects, a place familiar with performative acts, modified and curated to ensure that these powerful features and deposits were visible and monumentalised. The cave as a mnemonic for regional identity. Thus, a local ritual landscape at High Pasture was passed from generation to generation, demonstrated in its successive occupations and associated events throughout the Iron Age and back into earlier periods of prehistory. The maintenance of technical traditions, the repeated deposition of a recognised suite of offerings through the Iron Age indicates that the people who frequented this place passed on not only the memory of the landscape, but also of the operation of High Pasture itself, from generation to generation, a shared heritage and territorial anchorage. The intensification of activity at High Pasture during its later phases begs the question why, after such an extended period of use, was the cave finally sealed. The final insight that High Pasture may have given us into the social fabric of Iron Age society and Skye is that at some point it either may have seen significant upheaval, perhaps due to wider geopolitical changes, including the appearance of new religions, or that it finally came to see High Pasture Cave as too dangerous, too potent a place. Thank you very much. And I'll just pop up this slide to thank everybody who's been involved in this project through time.
Wow, that's a lot of people.
It is, yeah. I don't expect you to read them all.
I guess not surprising, really. Yeah. Well, thank you, Steve. Yeah, immensely for that. I mean, what an unbelievably fascinating site. You must have kind of become quite obsessed with trying to interpret the intricacies of it all over the years. Yeah, absolutely amazing. I mean, you've talked us through a lot of the like the maybes. This may be the case, that may be the case, kind of thing. But overall, what's your kind of feeling about what was going on here?
Well, I think I tried some it up. We're at the beginning of this story, really, and certainly the publication we go into a little bit more detail, and
Right.
it's to be left to future years, future analysis of the artifacts. I mean, one of the things in particular I'd love to get my head around is how far people were traveling to the site, and
Yeah.
that is a very difficult one to answer. We
Mm.
can look at the artifacts, we can look at the types of materials, look at the people themselves. We're never going to tell for certain, but certainly doing scientific provenancing of some of the materials like the cannel coal, the shale, the steatite, things like this can add to that picture, such as the geology that's coming from Argyll. And one thing we can say for sure is I get the feeling people visited that cave on a sort of ad hoc basis through early prehistory. It became a knowledgeable place. It became important in people's memories, somewhere to stop off at or whatever, somewhere important in the landscape. But through time, maybe then it became a sort of local shrine, judging by the scale of the activities in them early Iron Age events. And then what we see is a sort of elaboration of the site, which obviously takes more people to do. We see depositional events taking on a much more grand scale. And that included things like, I don't mention this, obviously too much to mention, but like the midden. At the end of a specific period of activity, we see these big dumps of midden which cover the site in the cave and at the surface, and incorporated out of these massive granite boulders and big chunks of limestone. They're not burnt. So were they parts of structures that they dismantled? Have they been carried in from elsewhere? Most of it's local stone. But what was the significance of adding these big lumps of rock and taking it into the cave down this quite tortuous route down the staircase into the cave? And, is that just a reason for bulk out the deposit and make it more impressive in its scale? And then you incorporate all the bits of objects, the complete objects, and the bits of people as well that comes with it. So, yes, I feel through time, you see these bigger aggregations of people, bigger events, and even looking at something so insignificant as charcoal, which we had a huge assemblage of charcoal down Ice. You can see in the early stages, in the early Iron Age, it's just two species. It's the local wood. It's hazel and it's birch, which still grows there today. But as you go through time, we get up to about 8 or 10 different types of wood charcoal, including Scots pine, for example. And we don't certainly, and we never have had Scots pine in the pollen record in that part of the Skye. We do have it towards the Kyles, to the Kyles of Loch Elsh and onto the mainland there. So again, are we seeing people carrying in these types of materials to take part? It's like us going on a barbecue somewhere on the beach and carrying all your bits with you, your barbecue package, and then you obviously shouldn't leave it there, but some people do. Are we seeing a similar sort of thing where this site got so important and it was appropriated by elites of some form that it took on a different significance and it became almost like a Lords, if you like, of the Iron Age, along with those other caves I've mentioned in England, like Wookiee, Victoria Cave, these sites which give a wealth of objects like this.
Yeah, interesting, absolutely fascinating. It's almost like, I suppose I'm vaguely biased here, it's almost like they were creating a museum of life, of their day-to-day practical life, and how it developed. It's extraordinary.
That's right. One thing I've used in talks before, I haven't often thought about it myself. Obviously, we see the site after a couple of thousand years lying there, and things have been moved around and through time and things like this. But you've got to imagine when people perhaps revisited that site after a year or 2 years or whatever, however frequently came in, it going into Bone Passage, for those who had the privilege, I suppose, if you want to call that, of getting to Bone Passage, would have seen all these things left by earlier people. So I should say it would have been very much like a museum with objects that have been passed on. I mean, one of those big saddle querns It's a huge saddle quern. Like I say, it takes 2 people to lift it.
Mm.
That appeared in the very early Stone Age deposition event. And we've certainly got no evidence for them sort of tools coming from the surface from the, the Bronze Age or whatever activities going on earlier. There's very little in the way of artifacts like that. So, it looks like it's an object that's been carried in for deposition. And this is what makes me wonder, could you even bring in midden material to put into this site?
Mm-hmm.
And again, more science in the future could certainly look at those stories. Now we can look at DNA of soils, and are those soils local? And we know from some other Iron Age sites, unusual Iron Age sites in Scotland, that sometimes the materials that are put there, it has been scientifically proven. Like, for example, at Dunvulen on the west coast of South Uist, the Brock there was materials put in one of its intramural passages that came from the peatlands, which were 2 miles, 2 kilometers away to the east. So that material was burnt elsewhere, carried and deposited in that passage in the Brock at Dunvulen. So, people were capable of doing these sort of things and were doing it for a specific reason.
Yeah.
So yes, plenty of work to do in the future for sure.
Yeah, fascinating. Extraordinarily complex human behavior and obviously belief systems and so on going on. Yes. I should give way to other people for questions. I'm sure there were.
Yeah, there's one from Sandra.
Yes, Sandra's had to go. She said
I noticed that. Yes.
She had lots of questions. Now are we? Lots of questions about sea levels. Fiskeveg may have been easier to access thousands of years ago. Are the origin places of the human remains known? It goes on and on. Have pollen been taken to understand the vegetation? And what species of deer are involved? Yes, it's lots and lots of questions.
We've certainly got answers to most of those. I mean, obviously we've got red deer and roe deer at High Pasture Cave. Mainly red deer, only a few elements of roe. And like I say, they were obviously hunting red deer, but they were also gathering the shed antler as well. But that could have been done from the settlements. But then they're given this representation of the different types of raw materials, along with finished objects made of the same materials. Fiskeveg, sea level change, it is something that's been questioned. There may have been a meter or meter and a half difference. I don't think it would have made a big difference to this site. I mean, the way we access the site, we had to go in by land. I've tried by boat a couple of times, even in calm conditions, to pick up a big rotary quern that's still in there. And we've not been able to get it out yet. But yeah, the way we went in was descending down a very steep sheep path between rock faces and then traversing under this very dangerous cliff face, which, some of the stone that comes off that, we always wore helmets when we approached the cave. If one of these things got you, it's like wheelie bins and things like that, small cars with massive rock falls. And that's what probably brought the site there to its end at one point. But yeah, that's another fascinating site. But, again, the interesting thing about that site is in one feasting deposit, there was 28 individual cattle, adult cattle represented. Now, some of them could have come in sort of split down packages, but we do have representation of cranial elements, forelimbs, hind limbs, things like this. And, these were big 3 to 4-year-old female animals as well, all females, which was quite interesting. But they're also carrying in things like oyster shells. We get the periwinkles on the shore and we get the limpets, but you don't get any oysters on that rocky shore at Fiskeveg. So maybe the fuels for burning, for smelting, which they're doing there, and doing metalworking is coming in, I'd have thought, by boat. But, it would have been difficult to carry all that in by hand for sure.
Amazing. So moving on. Yes. So are the origin places of the human remains known?
From High Pastures.
Yeah.
Well, I'd say with the adult female, we know that we did differential dentine analysis on a couple of her teeth. So you can then look at that individual from the isotopes to see if they move, the different types of groundwater that they took and things like this through time. And it looked like she did spend some time there was a period of maybe 14, 20 years of a life that was spent off Skye somewhere else.
Right.
But of course, the big problem is at the moment is we just don't have the sufficient data set from Skye, which has very complex geology, as you know.
Yeah.
Even where we are at high pastures, we have so many different rock types that, we need more isotope analysis of human remains, before we can say anything with any certainty. Like I say, we mentioned about the diet and things like this, but yeah, the two individuals, young individuals that show that almost exclusive marine signature, that is the most likely cause for that difference in their isotopes. But there is an outside chance that those individuals could have come from somewhere much warmer.
Right.
And that, again, could be interesting. Is it telling us that people were traveling into the site from elsewhere? Like, so hopefully a lot of these things with time can be looked at in more detail.
Yes. Okay. So Sheila, as Sandra's not here, I think we'll move on from her questions. Sheila Young says, I recall us looking for human habitation in the vicinity of the cave. Did you ever find where people were living?
Yes, we did. And that was one thing we were quite keen to do. Obviously, before High Pasture Cave, there was a few sites. There was a couple of dunes down on the shore by Torrin. There was a dune or semi-brock up in a glen, Dunkerstack, up in a glen not too far away as the crow flies from the site. But really, we knew of one or two circles in the landscape, but Martin Wildgoose and George Kozikowski and a team split off at one point from the main excavations and left me working there with the team. And they really did a survey of the surrounding landscape. So they did all of Strathsewardle from Broadford right through to Torrin and a bit beyond. And on top of that, there was further work that myself and Martin and George did doing walkover surveys for the John Muir Trust, the bigger landscape of the Cuillin and what have you. So, yeah, there are lots of circles. And in Strathsewardle, Martin found, I think it was 34, 36 individual roundhouses. And they test pitted these with small test pits, did trial trenches over the walls to look at how they were built, and obviously with various types of construction. A lot of these sites, unfortunately, they had very little inside them to such an extent. It's like other circles have been excavated on Skye and Slate. Were these sites just used temporary, like a shieling in the summertime, or just for animal use or something like this? Because there was very little in the way of cultural deposits inside them. One or two of them did give really good evidence for use. And one of them was very close to the site, almost at the bottom of the hill, where the resurging stream from High Pasture Cave comes out of the ground, and a little oxbow in the stream, an unusual place for an circle, was this big structure that Martin spent a bit more time on, and they excavated about half of the site. And that did produce really good evidence for metalworking, lots of iron slag, which is still yet to be analysed. And it makes me wonder if all the metalworking materials that ended up at High Pasture Cave came from that up circle down below. And in some way, those sites were connected as part of a bigger site spread over a slightly bigger distance. We have radiocarbon dates from quite a few sites, 20-odd sites. They ranged from early Bronze Age, 1200 BC, coming through the main period of High Pasture Cave through the Iron Age, for 800, 600 BC, 400 BC. But we even had people working in these roundhouses, whether they were using older structures, right through the early medieval, the Pictish period. We have a few good Pictish period dates. One of them had metalworking from that period as well, small scale. And then even one that had been repaved inside near the old marble quarry at Kilchrist. And on top of the paved floor, there was blue and white glazed ceramics. So, obviously a reuse of an older structure, but yeah, people were living in the round for quite some time, I feel, in parts of Skye. So yeah, good evidence, but certainly, looking at the sites, even if quite a few of them were in contemporary use, not enough people to populate the big feasts that were taking place on them, pigs and cattle, which could have fed hundreds of people on the day,
Which does suggest lots of people coming in. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, are they just coming from other parts of Skye? Did it start as a local thing in that part of Skye and then spread to a Skye-wide, event, if you like, coming to that site? Or are we seeing people coming from further afield? And I'd rather think we are seeing people like a Lourdes coming in from further afield. This place gained a reputation like one or two other special sites. And, the thing is, we've got a lot of caves and rock shelters in Scotland. Quite a few have been excavated, quite a few have not. But generally speaking, you get a good feel for these sites when you first go in, seeing what's scattered on the floors if they're not buried. Trial trenching that's gone on by different projects, like Scotland's first settlers. Obviously, they were looking for early activity, but they picked up a lot of Iron Age and Bronze Age as well. But, none of these sites, whether rock shelters or other natural caves like High Pasture, have produced anything like an assemblage of material. The only other sites that have are these sites like Wookiole, Victoria Cave and such like, with the human remains as well.
That kind of addresses another question I had, which is, how rare a place do you think this was in its time? Pretty special by the seam of it.
Yeah. At the moment, I think unique in Scotland. Let's say we have a few nice caves that produce some good materials, but it's tiny compared to High Pastures. I mean, High Pasture Cave, if you look at it compared even to other sites, it's produced as bigger stone assemblages, something like the excavations at Brocksmith Hill Fort, or one of the big Brock villages like Howe in Orkney. And so it's up in that sort of scale, but here you're talking of a little cave and this almost roundhouse size precinct outside. So yes, at the moment it is special. We know we've got 3,900 registered caves and rock shelters in Scotland, and none of them have given this sort of level of activity.
Yeah, absolutely amazing. I'm going to probably fit lots and lots of messages of thanks and appreciation, by the way, have come through.
Well, thank you very much.
And quite a few people had to go.
I'm sorry you went on a bit.
my
I always do.
Final question is, I mean, how difficult an excavation was this technically? I mean, it seems to me, just thinking about things like trying to untangle, four different staircases, through time. I mean, that must have been a hell of a job trying to sort all that out.
Yeah, I think the main one with the staircases is, obviously we excavated them to destruction because we got to one point and we thought, right, can we leave this staircase on display for people to visit? Which would have been lovely, there's no doubt. But there's already signs of a big limestone block about to peel away from the rock face above the staircase. The staircase itself was very rickety. Even as we were using it, it was getting, displaced a bit. So being able to dismantle those staircases one after the other give us a great opportunity to look at the site, right through its history, right back to the natural cave entrance behind that had been modified. And so, very difficult, even to start the excavations in the cave. You're adapting your normal excavation strategies as you went on. It's a very sticky mud. So at first, we didn't have the staircase open. We had to go in through the caver's entrance, which meant 30-odd, 40 metres, a bit of hands and knees, a bit of standing up, carrying rubber kibbles full of material, then hoisting them up through the caver's entrance on a hoist, and then add the wet sieving at the surface. Because this material, as it often is in caves, was very sticky, and you couldn't trowel it with a metal trowel and get a surface. And when you did use a metal trowel, you were just breaking objects and bone all the time. So, we raided the kitchen department. We got little wooden plastic spatulas, and that's generally, you nibble it out in chunks, recorded material in situ that you could see in a 3D way. And then other material came out by half-meter grid squares and context by levels, which were then, captured in the wet sieve and the fine sieving. So then we were getting all the seeds and all the burnt grain and everything else, land snails and everything that goes with it, So, it's the most intensive excavated site. And I was keen to do that. We could have just done a metre long trial trench, which we started with to test it out. it wouldn't have given you the story. And we've seen that the same with the Resmarki caves.
Mm,
You know,
mhm.
in the Leone
Mm,
caves where we got Resmarki Man and everything else, they started as test pits, and it's
mm,
great because they give you data material, told you what range you were working in, you know, Iron
mhm.
Age up through the Pictish period, up into the Traveller period and such like, but it didn't give you that bigger picture of what was going on. And it's only when we expanded the trench you start to find things like Resmarki Man, of course, but also the metalworking, the in situ metalworking,
Mm,
and
mhm.
things like this. And now we've got this incredible story for the Resmarki caves, and that wouldn't have been possible without
Without,
larger scale excavation.
yeah. Mm. Well, fascinating. Looking forward to this publication, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, hopefully later this year.
Right.
That's the
Okay.
yeah, that's the. I mean, it's a big volume, so it's going to take
Yeah.
Oxbow Books a little bit of time, I think, to get it out there. There's a lot of photographs as well. Yeah, so I'm looking forward to it myself. We've got the front
Amazing.
cover now and back cover, so that's the start.
Brilliant. Well, I guess probably, unless anybody else has a burning question, we probably ought to wrap up, really. But that has been absolutely fascinating.
And did the
I,
pictures come over okay, Alistair?
yeah. Oh,
In the
yeah.
small scale. I'm
Yes. I
sorry it
mean,
didn't work.
no, it was okay, actually. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Good,
Thank you
good.
very much.
Well, thank you for all for your help anyway, and for inviting me along. It's been nice to do it.
All right. Well, it's been an absolute pleasure. Yeah. Great stuff. Good, good. Well, we'll no doubt see you soon in the inn.
Absolutely. Yeah, for sure.
We can talk some more about it. Great. Okay. If that's anybody else for anything, or are you all dying to have
All
a
gone
cup of
already.
tea? All right. Great stuff. Thanks again, Steve. We'll wrap it up.
Okay. Thank you
Cheers.
very much.
Yep.
Bye bye now.
Bye. Bye now.
Night.